first one. We have Guillaume Lambert with us from Panoptic. I just came across his option protocol, which kind of really innovative solution, and thought it would be fun to have him in. In terms of his background, Guillaume is an assistant professor in applied physics at Cornell University and is currently on leave to build Panoptic, the perpetual option protocol on Ethereum. So welcome, Guillaume.
All right, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Imran. Thanks everyone from DeFi Toronto for inviting me. Yeah, so today I'm going to tell you about Panoptic, which is this options protocol that I'm building. This is a perpetual options protocol based on top of Uniswap v3. So long story short, Panoptic enables the buying and selling of options on any asset that is currently tradable on Uniswap v3, and it can do it in a way that's fully decentralized and permissionless. So how do we achieve this? There's three pillars, I guess, to Panoptic. So the first one is that we kind of realize that moving liquidity in a Uniswap pool or removing it from a Uniswap pool by borrowing an LP token, this creates an options-like payoff. So you have what looks like a short put, a long put here. If it crosses your strike, which is where we remove the liquidity, it looks like a put payoff. So that's kind of an interesting first observation. The second observation is that the fees that are generated by your position, so if you look at a very narrowly defined position, it could be a tick wide or a few percent wide, this position will accumulate fees according to the trading activity that happens organically within the Uniswap pool. And the fees that you would collect as a liquidity provider is the same as the premium you collect as an options seller. So typically you sell an option, you get paid right away. Here, the pricing is path dependent and it starts at 0, but it can keep on going forever, years, if you want to keep your position on. And finally, the third pillar, I guess, of Panoptic is the capital efficiency. And we say we bring fungible liquidity providing back to Uniswap v3. For those that know about Uniswap v3, this is again a decentralized exchange that enables any tokens to be swapped. But at the end of at the back end, you have to have liquidity providers that provide liquidity by depositing token in this pool. In UniV2 and UniV1, the previous version, it was very easy to do. UniV3 made it a bit more complicated, so that may have scared off a few users, or in a way that is kind of detrimental to the protocol. So what we bring back to Uniswap v3 is this kind of passive, less intense liquidity management to Uniswap v3. So this is the basic outline of the talk. I'll go briefly over each one. There's a small demo at the end of the day, at the end as well. So let's get started. So I'm going to talk about options first and describe how they relate to the Uniswap LP providing. But then first question is, why trade options? And I personally trade options at the retail level in TradFi. And I like to trade options way more than stocks or even tokens, because they you can have control over the directional outcome of your strategy. If you want to be delta neutral and say that the price will be between point A and point B, you can generate a strategy that will generate profit if it does stay within that range. You can have a strategy that profits if the price collapses and goes down. You can have a strategy that also is omnidirectional but has a peak of profitability around a certain price. So all of these payoffs generate a lot of diversity that's way different than the up to the right type of payoff you see by trading tokens. Now you can create synthetic payoffs to your choosing, neutral, positive, or negative. And also, all of this pricing and the probability is backed by math. In a way that I'm a physicist, the math makes sense to me, because the math used to price an option is actually very similar to the math used in my own research when I look at, say, a molecule diffusing in water. So the diffusion of a particle in water looks a lot like a diffusion of price in a sea of freighter. So all of the quantities that you can extract are somewhat mathematically defined and really easy to derive and understand. And finally, there's also a capital efficiency component that is, you can see with options that currently is not seen, perhaps with perps to some extent, but here this is built in, because you have to deposit some collateral to be able to trade, but you can be between 2x and 15x more capital efficient than just buying a token outright. You can create these type of strategies with a much reduced capital requirement. And again, I showed a few different payoffs. there's a whole zoo of payoffs you can create, and they all have funny names, but these are actually positions I have traded in the past. Maybe I have something on in TradFi. And what we enable is have this type of diversity. Each one could be a vault, for instance, a delta rule, but each one of those strategies could also be synthesized in DeFi and Uniswap v3. So going back to Uniswap v3, for those that may be familiar or maybe not, but at the end of the day, what happens with Uniswap v3 is that you specify a certain price range at which you deploy liquidity. You can say, I think the price will be of ETH, for instance, will be between 1,000 and 3,000. You can actually deploy liquidity only to that range, and you will collect fees when it's in that range, but it's not going to collect any fee if it's leaving that. So the key point is that instead of having a liquidity curve, X times Y equals K, that is valid for any price X and Y, you kind of collapse this so that it's only valid for a certain range. And if this is the lower range, you're below your range, it's 100% ETH. If it's above the range, it's 100% stablecoin if you were to participate in the ETH stablecoin pool. So the payoff or the value of your LP position looks like this, where it's, again, linear in price below the lower tick, stable above. And if you look at this and squint a little bit, it looks a lot like a covered call option strategy. So you don't have to know about covered calls, but it actually has a very similar payoff where the strike or the midpoint of this would correspond to your strike price. And the same way that you would lose funds if it's below your strike and it's stable above, you also have the same thing happening with your Uni V3 position. And that's kind of the basic observation that we started with. If you're liquidity providing right now in Uniswap v3, you're selling options, whether you know it or not, because the fact of adding liquidity creates this short put payoff or covered call payoff. And that's kind of a mathematical fact. The shape of the return looks like a short put. The fact that you provide liquidity, this generates this type of position. So thinking of Uni v3 LPing in terms of option selling has helped me tremendously as an LP, but also should be the way to approach this whenever you want to be LPing in Uniswap v3, because you're actually selling puts. And permanent loss notwithstanding, there's actually a capped return on the high end, and that's kind of what you have to deal with when you're trading or deploying liquidity in Uniswap. So right now, you can go to any pool that exists, deploy liquidity, and generate what looks like selling a put. Selling a put is fine, but what about buying options, which is also a valid strategy? You can buy options for hedging purposes to have upside exposure. So if providing liquidity is selling an option, if you borrow or remove that liquidity and you go through the math, it actually flips the payoff curve, and what you had as a short put beforehand now becomes a long put. So there's a question about trade the vol separately through the protocol. So what I'm going to kind of walk through perhaps, but the tiny amount here that's negative in the red, and the tiny amount here that's in the green, it's your premium that you collect. So you collect some premium by trading activity. If it's in range, you would pay some premium, and that will be you don't need a volatility oracle. You don't need to input any value. It's just a real trading activity. So I'll come back to that, but the key point is that providing liquidity is selling a put. Removing liquidity is buying a put. So these are the two kind of strategies that you need to have if you want to trade options on any, I guess, underlying, and especially on the blockchain. So when we kind of realized this, we found maybe a problem is that when you borrow some funds, there's always a risk of bad debt. If there's a bank run or if there's a black swan event, people may not be able to pay back their debt. Now they can go and buy a car or do something else that's kind of outside of the realm of the blockchain. So what we realize is that instead of having funds sent to the users, we actually move them in a different smart contract. So it's still within the blockchain ecosystem. It's manipulated by the user, but it's never owned by the user. So someone that borrows a bit of liquidity to buy a put, the funds that have been borrowed are secured in a Panoptic the Panoptic pool smart contract. And if you need to seize someone's asset, or if you need to liquidate or exercise, you just have to move that liquidity that's owned by the protocol and move it back to where it belongs. So that also kind of reduces the risks of under collateralization, and also makes liquidations a lot more simple because the funds are never leaving the Panoptic Uniswap ecosystem. So just to be sure that everybody is on the same page, I'll go through a user flow for buying a put. So you think that the merge will have a dire consequences, it's going to fail. You say it's going to, the price is going to go down, let me buy $1,000 put USDC. So as a user, you would borrow some liquidity that is in Uniswap at a strike of 1,000 and move it to the Panoptic pool. And this liquidity will be kind of maybe assigned to you, but you can't really touch it. And if you look at what happens as a function of the price, so the price currently is maybe 1,600. If the price stays 1,600 and nothing happens, the merge is successful, you just move the funds back. You pay perhaps a small fee, but there's no outcome. The payoff is flat because you started by borrowing something, move it back, nothing changed. But if there's a price move, and the price does go down and crosses your strike, now it's 800, for instance. So it went from 1,600, went down. What the key point is that this chunk of liquidity that was borrowed initially was equal to 1,000 DAI or 1,000 stablecoin, but now because the price has crossed it, this has been kind of automatically transformed into a debt of 1 ETH. So you borrow 1,000 USDC, you have to pay back 1 ETH. So the key point is that since the price has gone down, the user can go on the open market, buy 1 ETH for 800, pay back the ETH, keep 1,000. Their payoff is strike minus spot, 1,000 minus 800, they make $200, and they have a profit because their assumption that the price was going to go down was kind of realized and successful. So at the end of the day, that's kind of how an option in Panoptic works. Removing liquidity is buying an option, moving it back is selling an option. And the payoff, you can go with all the cases. This is selling puts. Calls is on the other side. You can extract the same exact payoffs as the short put and the short call and the long call. So this is something that I've been kind of researching on my own, starting, I guess, more than a year ago. And this is my first article on my Medium blog, but it was titled UniV3 to LP tokens as perpetual puts and call options. So overall, I've been thinking about these ideas, and that helped me tremendously in my LPing. So I've been able to identify strategies for me as an LP in Uniswap. But beyond that, because I wanted to get to be able to create these more complex strategies, access the liquidity and access the capital efficiency that we can see in TradFi. That's why now I'm kind of taking a leave from my position to build Panoptic full time. So that's kind of the origination story of how Panoptic options exists. Yes. So I'll go over the pricing. So the next slide, there's a question about the pricing. This is exactly what I'm going to talk about. So typically when you sell an option, when you buy an option, you do it by interacting with a market maker. So that could be Citadel maybe, or it could be some other market making firms, but they take your order, they find what they think is the appropriate price. They maybe add a little spread to it, make a few pennies of profit per transaction. But overall, the pricing itself in TradFi is extremely efficient. And the spreads are tiny because everybody agrees on the price. There's no, the order book is very narrow because the price is dependent on a small number of factors that are easy to predict. In Panoptic or in UniV3 for that matter, we don't have market makers that can do these computations. We don't have external entities that can tell us what the volatility is. We have to think about pricing in a different manner. And this is what we have to solve as well. So this is what we call the Oracle-less Black-Scholes pricing. So Black-Scholes is the model that all of these market making firms use. We use a similar system without any Oracle, and I'll mention what it means. So if we go to a UniV3 position that someone has deployed, it can be very narrow, and it looks at a few maybe percent above the strike price. And if you look at different price paths that exist, so the history may change between tomorrow and a few days after, but you can look at 3 separate scenarios where 3 price paths started at this point. The first one moved and never touched the range here, the gray bar. So you deployed some liquidity above the current price, price never crossed this, you collect no fee. So that's kind of a not an optimal outcome for you, deploy some liquidity. After 7 days, you have zero. You can have a different scenario where the price did cross and move way up, and you collect some amount of fee. Or the best case scenario perhaps for you is that the price did hover back and forth, crab season-like style, and did accumulate a lot of fees, perhaps more than 1/8, corresponding to being justified in your assumption that the price will be in that range, and you collect a lot of fees. So you can do a rough calculation that tells you how much fees you collect. That's a function of the fee tier, which is how much you collect per transaction, how much liquidity you yourself own, how much volume happens every day, the tick liquidity, meaning how much other players or LPers are there with you that you have to share it with, and also how long you wait. So it's a very simple expression, and that tells you about what the expected fee should be. Sometimes it's zero, sometimes it's way above, some other times it's an intermediate number. So the key, another explanation we have to do is, what's the relationship between this expected return that you get from real physical trading activity in Uniswap and the predictions made by Black-Scholes, this kind of trusted model that options market maker use and have used for the past 3 or 4 decades. So if you do this, again, you have this payoff that's a short put. Normally, the premium would be this plateau here. What if we say that the trading fee is also the premium you receive? Typically, in an option, you sell it a few days from expiration, maybe 7 days, 20 days, even a year from expiration. That changes how much you collect. What if we say that the fees collected after 7 days, for instance, is the options premium? So by doing this, and I'm not going to go too much into the details, we have a white paper out, but the fact that you look at the accumulated premium, it's as if you were rolling an option every block. And every block that is in range, you collect some fees. If it's out of range, you collect nothing. And you can take this accumulation of fees and you can extract what you can integrate more or less. You can extract what the final premium would be. If you use Black-Scholes, you have a Gaussian that looks like the function you have to integrate. If you use UniV3, it's a square step function. So for the mathematically inclined, it's probably a heresy to say, oh, I'm going to approximate this Gaussian with a rectangle. But as a physicist, there's always these shortcuts, and I'm perfectly happy with doing this. So you can do a similar set of approximations that say we have this smooth Gaussian-like function for Black-Scholes. In Uniswap v3, we have this square block. What if we still assume that it's the same answer? You can actually get to a point where you can also estimate how much premium you would collect. It's also dependent on the size of your position, but it's contained a few different quantities, including a sigma here. Sigma is the implied volatility of that option. So the key point that we were able to extract is that fees that are collected gives you some return. If you say these returns are Black-Scholes determined, that enables you to fit a implied volatility to that number. So what we can see now is that if we have a 7-day option and we look at the different price paths as before, a few of these options had 0 fee. So you sell an option for nothing. Sometimes it's 85% of what Black-Scholes would have predicted. Some of the time it's way higher. But if you look at the distribution, a lot of the options cost nothing at the end of the day. So as an options buyer, this is good for you. You buy an option, you hold it for 7 days, you never got to exercise, the price moved away, so you don't pay anything. So you can burn it or unmint it at no cost. So that's a kind of costless option. If it does cross, or if you're unlucky and it stays there for a while, then you pay a lot more. But at the end of the day, if you look at simulations, you can look at the whole distribution of returns, you can find the average, and by doing this, you see the premium, the average premium is giving you kind of what you need to solve for this IV. So I'm going to come back to this in a moment. There's also a question about the vol surface. I'll cover that. But at the end of the day, this IV here is what is important. It links the Black-Scholes model, which is a Nobel Prize winning model, and the Uniswap kind of returns in a way that makes it so that there's a single parameter, the IV, is what you need to solve for. And I have a personal fork of the Uniswap interface. I'll share it with you at the end in a demo. And I do publish these numbers, and that should tell you about the returns you would get by LPing to these pools. is similar to setting an option with a IV that's given by this number. So Andy, I think you had a few questions. We'll go back to that towards the end of the talk. So again, we have the Black-Scholes, which is TradFi-like, very, very corporate. We have Uniswap, which is unicorns and rainbows, but we can actually link them by this single number, which is the IV. And that's what we do in Panoptic. Fees are premium. We just fit for that premium. And now you have an interplay between buying and selling that's a little bit more, I guess, complete. Because if you deploy liquidity to a certain region, you increase the liquidity. This increased liquidity will decrease volatility. So sell something, the price will go down. And that's the only thing you can do now in Uniswap. You can only sell. So the price is bound to go down. If buyers now can come in and buy an asset, I guess the market demands make it so that the price of that asset will now increase. So buying removes liquidity, increases volatility, increases returns for the option seller. So now we have kind of this way of generating an options payoff, pricing them in a way that's accurate that both the buyer and the seller would kind of agree to. And now we have kind of these market forces that will kind of shape the amount of liquidity in a pool, not driven by what the LP thinks is right, but rather how buying and selling shapes this. So the two pricing and payoff were very important for the protocol to work. The last leg, I guess, of this table is being able to be capital efficient. So in TradFi, most brokerage firms, most banks enable users to trade options in a under-collateralized manner. You don't have to put 100% of the funds. You have to put a tiny fraction that corresponds to the risks you're taking on. So what happens now in Panoptic is that liquidity providers will provide liquidity to the Uniswap pools. These Uniswap pools, the fees in these pools will be static. They won't even move beyond that. And it's users or option sellers that will borrow that liquidity and populate, I guess, the Uniswap pool by setting options where they think each vertical bar could be an option that's sold, but they will sell an option in a way that will generate where they think the payoff is going to go. So if there's skew in the liquidity distribution, that's going to generate skew in the IV. If there's a lot of liquidity here, there's going to be a low IV. If there's much less, there's going to be high IV. And at the end of the day, this back and forth between buyer and sellers will be what shapes the liquidity distribution on Uniswap v3. So you can go on the info.uniswap interface. You can see physically where the liquidity is located. Now what's going to happen is that this buying and selling will be the driving force to kind of perhaps shape this. So now we have this scenario where a liquidity provider, a whale, a DAO, a large fund, deposits their funds in the Panoptic pool. A user mints options. So let's say they mint 4 options. And the collateral requirement that we ask for the seller, the user, is similar to what you see in TradFi. It's going to be 20% of notional for short options and 10% of notional for long options. So here's what I mean by that. So if they sell these 4 options, short strangle, that's a delta neutral, Jade laser, omnidirectional strategy, long call, extremely bullish, long straddle, this is buying volatility. Each one of those corresponds to 1, 2, or 3 different options that are combined into a single instrument. But each one of those is physically moving funds into the Uniswap pool. So this long straddle, for instance, moves 1,500 DAI and 1 ETH near the spot price. Long call moves 1 ETH above the spot price. Jade Lizard, it's moving 3 units of liquidity, but it's at the end of the day only moving 200 DAI and 0.5. And a short strangle is moving 2,000 DAI on one side and 1 ETH at the other side. So physically, you have to move this liquidity, but because the liquidity is owned by Panoptic and not necessarily owned by the user, we can actually have these lower buying power requirements so that instead of charging, or requiring the user to have 1,500 DAI and 1 ETH in the Panoptic pool, we can have a much lower requirement. For instance, instead of being 1,500, it's only 10% of that, 150 DAI for the put part of the straddle. Here, there's no put. Here, there's 400, 20% of this, 400, 200% of this. So at the end of the day, the put side only requires 950 DAI. The call side also requires 0.9 ETH. So you can effectively control 3.5 ETH, 5,500 DAI by only depositing much less, 950 DAI and 0.9 ETH. So this is the concept of leverage. You own a little bit, you control way more. And basically, this is what we enable in the protocol itself. Every time someone mints an option, we have this buying power requirement. So capital efficiency is built into the protocol. So where does that leave us? So we have options payoff, we have accurate pricing, we also have no, defi-native, sorry. We also have capital efficiency, and that's replicating a lot of what you see in TradFi. And that's why we think we are truly a 0-to-1 innovation in the world of options, whereas other protocols maybe try to copy paste what happens in TradFi to DeFi. Here we're using a very Defi-native optional instrument, and hopefully we can attract the DeFi-native users, because what we want to do is replicate to some extent the Uniswap model. So in Uniswap, everything is permissionless. You don't have to ask permission to deploy a new pool or a new pair or a new fee tier. Everything is up to the users. I've deployed myself a few Uniswap pairs, and I'm sure that some of you may have done it, but all of it is permissionless. And this is going to my alma mater where I work is at Cornell. The founder said, I would found a protocol where any person can trade options on any asset. They had a person who can find institutional information in any study. But at the end of the day, we want to be able to be as open as possible, as permissionless, and have the market drive perhaps adoption. And as I mentioned, what we see the before and after of Uniswap, where before Uniswap, you had either deltas of the world, on-chain order books that tried to copy-paste TradFi onto the blockchain, didn't gain traction. Uniswap came in, very elegant interface, very simple to understand process. You input token A, you get token B, no other things to worry about, market orders, stop loss, anything of that. So everything is automated. And I think we see the same problem with existing options protocol, but also TradFi options. I don't know if you trade options, but if you go on your TD Ameritrade tab of options, it's horrendous. It's an Excel spreadsheet of numbers. You have to know what each one of those are. It's very, very, very opaque. What we want to bring in is a very visual, very easy to use, maybe with preloaded strategies, but we want to create a way for anybody to generate these payoffs in a way that they don't have to think about all the little minutiae of the numbers, but rather preload them from a kind of set of predefined strategies. If they want to sell a single call, that's fine. But if you want to create a delta neutral strategy or a vault protocol wants to create a delta neutral vault, they can do it very easily using our protocol. So, and there was a mention of a demo in the the UX. So there's a demo in the at the end of this. So I myself got a grant from the Uniswap grants program to expand the ideas of LPing, how options and LP positions are very similar, but also that allowed me to fork the Uniswap interface, where I do have an app, which is exactly like the Uniswap app, where you can deploy liquidity. I'll go over what it looks like in a minute, but it's a slightly more visual also, but shows a little bit more information than the vanilla Uni interface. Also the info, where I do publish out numbers about volatility surfaces, skew, and all of that. So let me go and share my desktop, and I'll show the actual interface itself. It's on yewbow.org. You can add the app or the info. The info, again, if you're familiar with Uniswap v3, you may have visited the info. It's just all the different tokens, all the different pairs. And it tells you information about each one of them. The key point is that I do compute the implied volatility, and I do publish it for all the pools that exist. So if I look at only the ETH and stablecoin pairs, again, there's thousands of them, but you have ETH USDC 30 basis point, ETH USDC 5 basis point, ETH USDC 100 basis point. All of them exist. They have different volume, different fee, different TVL. But at the end of the day, the optimal scenario is that they have the same IV. The IV is the return you get. Sometimes some pools have a slightly higher IV than others. For instance, the 5 basis point in USDC is the highest one in the stablecoin ETH pair. This one is the lowest one. So if you go and visit this one, we can also see the liquidity distribution. So here, this is where every unit of liquidity is deployed in that pool. And you can see the distribution. If you hover with your mouse, slowly, it tells you a bit of information here. There's a right here. This is the IV at the currently traded. It's 70% IV, but if you go on each side, this is where the volatility skew comes in. You have a smile where on one side you have 130% IV, on this side you have a little bit less. So that's kind of how you can create now directional deployment of liquidity that kind of perhaps nullify or leverages the IV curve. So again, this is a bit more advanced, but that type of information is provided. You also have the I'll go with, the uni pool is also very interesting, but if you're LPing, if you want to choose a new pool to participate to, you should go on that. So you can see how the IV changes over time. And the dashed line here is the average. And sometimes it's higher. So when the implied volatility is higher than the realized, there's an edge to sell options or to provide liquidity. If it's below, you should not be providing liquidity. So that should tell you about when is a good time to participate to these pools. In the past, whatever, 2 or 3 months have been very, very useful for Uni ETH pair. So that's the info where you can use this to guide your decision making when you're creating a liquidity position. There's also the interface. At first glance, it looks very much like the default Uniswap interface. You can swap whichever token you want. But the pool tab here is where, again, this is an interface that I wanted to use and wanted to be able to use in a way that makes sense. So from the page, you see your positions, but also where the price is with respect to a range. So some of those are right in the middle. Sometimes they are way above, way below these shit point that I don't want to get rid of. But for instance, I do have ETH uni pair, for instance, and I can see the payoff of my position. So even though I'm right in the middle, I'm a tiny bit profitable. And if the price were to go up, way up, I would get, I don't know, 0.15 return. Now, if it's below, this is where impermanent loss comes in and I will lose. So that's kind of one way to visualize it, where you stand with respect to the current price and your range. I also do it with Squeeth. Squeeth is a perpetual protocol. I actually do it in a hedged amount. So what happens now is that I borrow some Squeeth, lock it with my own ETH, and I create this delta neutral position. So now what happens is that if the price goes way up, I'm in the red. If it goes way down, I'm in the red. But if it stays within that range, and now even if it leaves it a little bit, I'm still in the green, then this is where I'm happy to be in. So in that case, I may unwind this because the returns have been very good. You can see how it looks like for the past, whatever, I think 60 days or 90 days. So at the end, this is also a different tool that you as a LP, a DeFi user, wants to use for providing liquidity in Uniswap. With Panoptic.
Yes.
Sorry, we're just we're a little bit over time, so
sure.
We wanted to spare some time.
I was ending there. So with Panoptic, we'll have a similar interface, but then it's going to be options like a little bit more complex, but still some similar feel and visualization. So again,
excellent.
Thanks for allowing me to go over a little bit, but yeah.
That was wonderful, and maybe we can have you back for a part 2 as well. And if anyone has any questions for Yum, please just put them in the chat, and hopefully you don't mind sticking around for a few minutes just so that you can answer some of those questions if you don't mind. That would be great. Thank you, sir. We will jump right into the next one.